This day has been long awaited, but it is finally here. Bernie Sanders is officially the front runner in the 2020 Democratic primary by every single metric. For the first time ever, including the 2016 race, Bernie Sanders has a lead in the Real Clear Politics average of polls. Now, for those of you who've been following the show for a while, you know that I am not one of those people who see polling in presidential primaries or really in any election as the be-all, end-all. There are other metrics that I think are way more important, and I'll get to those in a little bit later. But Bernie Sanders taking the lead in the Real Clear Politics average of all polls is monumental. Because this isn't just one poll. This isn't an outlier. There aren't 16 other polls that say otherwise. No. This is the aggregate of all polls, and the trend is crystal clear that Bernie Sanders has an overwhelming lead in popularity across the country. Now, this, combined with a host of other factors, including Joe Biden's terrible performance in Iowa and his clock about to be cleaned in New Hampshire tonight, make it almost undeniable at this point that Joe Biden's campaign is basically over. He's a dead man walking. Because for this entire race, all Joe Biden has had to make him seem relevant, to make him seem like he had a chance at winning the Democratic nomination, it was simply his lead in the polls. And because he was using this to make this argument that he is the most electable candidate in the race. He's more electable than some raggedy old socialist from Vermont, and he's in the best position in terms of popularity to go toe-to-toe with Donald Trump. That was the crux, that was the root of Joe Biden's entire campaign. Now, as I get into the other metrics where Bernie Sanders is blowing out everyone else in the race, it's going to be crystal clear. It's going to be clear that that argument that Joe Biden and all his allies in the mainstream media and the political establishment were making was just a bunch of hot air. So the metric of crowd size, it's an important metric. It shows how excited people are about your campaign if they're willing to come out and listen to you speak. And if it's especially listen to a stem speech that you've been repeating across the country, city to city. So if people are willing to come out to see you do that, of course, those same people and some are going to come out to see you vote. Are going to come out to vote for you on election day. When it comes to crowd size, it's no competition between Bernie Sanders and the other people in this race. Bernie Sanders regularly has thousands and thousands of people show up at his events. The first event that he had after his heart attack, the mainstream media was trying to prognosticate that this is the end of Bernie Sanders. He's done. He's toast. He's going to look weak to the voters. All his supporters are going to flee. That was the argument that the mainstream media was making. Instead, what did Bernie Sanders do? He filled out a giant park outside venue in New York with 20,000 people. There were so many people who came out to see Bernie Sanders at his first event back that the venue that they had in the park couldn't even contain everybody. The overflow extended blocks outside of the park. And like I said, 20,000 people showed up to hear Bernie Sanders talk. That is amazing, unprecedented, and it was the largest campaign event of the entire primary season. And all of the largest campaign events during the primary have been held by Bernie Sanders. Sure, at certain times in the race, there were different candidates who were able to turn out and have, a decent amount of people come out, a couple hundred people, maybe a couple thousand people, but no one has ever been able to touch Bernie Sanders. And Joe Biden, who was, like I said, considered the front runner this entire time by the mainstream media and the political establishment, well, Joe Biden couldn't ever fill out a goddamn gymnasium at a high school. So the narrative that was trying to be built around Joe Biden about this electability, it was not translating to real life when you look at his campaign events, and there's nobody out there, and the people who are out there, they aren't excited. I remember this very sad video that Jordan Sheridan did on his channel Status Quo, where he was at a Joe Biden debate watch party at this bar or this restaurant or whatever. It was sad. It was pathetic. There was barely anybody out there. And then there was like 3 people out there, 3, 4, 5 people out there. And the one guy who was repping Joe Biden's merch and wearing his t-shirts and stuff like that, when when Jordan Sheridan asked him, why you out there? Why you at this debate watch party? Why you supporting Joe Biden? He says, I really don't know. I like the word malarkey. I'll show you the clip. It's gross. But there was no real excitement. There was no substantive reason to be out there. And that's sad because at your campaign events, that's supposed to be where your most energized base of support is. And if Joe Biden, on a regular basis, his campaign events, there aren't people who are excited to be there, that's a bad sign for you. And especially if you aren't even turning out large numbers. Let's go to the volunteers. So, unprecedented. This has never happened before in primary history. Bernie Sanders, within the first week of launching his campaign, had over 1 million volunteers sign up to work on his campaign. Again, breaking records. This is historic, never happened before in primary history. And just think about what that kind of grassroots army can do, the amount of phone banking and doors you can knock on and events that can be organized. When you have 1 million volunteers across the country, it is unprecedented. And from there, it was clear to me that Bernie Sanders was in front runner status. Let's look at individual donors. Again, Bernie Sanders, trailblazer, set the standard that he isn't taking corporate PAC money, he isn't raising money from millionaires, that he isn't raising money from billionaires, and that he's going to be funding his campaign strictly from small dollar individual donors. His average donation this time in this primary election cycle is $17. Now, this metric usually doesn't matter in primaries because they're all raising corporate money, and then the individual donors money, the money that they raise from individual donors, or the amount of individual donors that they have, is usually negligible compared to the super PACs that they have and the corporate money that they're raising for their campaigns. But since Bernie Sanders set the standard that he isn't taking that, all eyes are on how many donors that he can amass to donate to his campaign, and by that metric, blowing out every other candidate in this race, showing that he has the most support. Hundreds of thousands more donors than the next closest competitor. The amount of money, so the dollar figures that Bernie Sanders has been able to raise, again, blowing out any of his closest competitors. In the last quarter, I believe he had almost $10 million more in donations than Pete Buttigieg, who came in second. And this has been consistent through every quarter of this primary election cycle. So, and this number is what the mainstream media loves to harp away on as to who's in front runner status, how the money race, how much money are you raising? And by that metric, Bernie Sanders has always been out front. And now with the voting starting, primaries are being held now across the country. Bernie Sanders has shown that he's a front runner by that metric too, winning the popular vote in Iowa, despite the fact that Pete Buttigieg's, the shady app that Pete Buttigieg paid for was caught changing votes and taking votes away from Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders still won the popular vote in Iowa, which by my count means that he won Iowa. And now he's on track to have a blowout night here in New Hampshire and is projected to win. And Nate Silver, notorious Bernie Sanders hater, smear merchant of the left, and mouthpiece of the establishment Hillary Clinton wing of the Democratic Party. Even he projects Bernie Sanders is going to win. Not 5, not 10, not 20. He projects Bernie Sanders is going to win every single primary contest in the country. So it's really hard to wrap your mind around how resounding this Bernie Sanders frontrunner status really is. And it's especially remarkable considering the fact that there's an unprecedented amount of candidates running in this primary. I believe at one point there were 25 candidates running in this race. And so this is more decisive and definitive than it had this been just a 2, 3, 4 person race now. Because like I said, unprecedented amount of candidates. So the people have this entire time, they've had an entire array of candidates that they could choose from. So it's not like some fluke that Bernie Sanders has this undeniable front runner status in terms of individual donors, in terms of actual donations raised or crowd size, or now in the polling metric. This entire time, the voters have had many different candidates that they could choose to support and that they could choose to get behind. So the fact that Bernie Sanders has this resounding position as the undeniable frontrunner, it completely puts an end to this myth that Bernie Sanders, or that socialism and social democrats they're so scary and the American people aren't ready for it, and therefore they're just unelectable. That puts all of that to bed. All of it. Because if that was true in any way, then there are many different, like I said, many different candidates that the people could go to, and Bernie Sanders would not have this position in every single metric if those things were true. If people were scared of socialism, if people were scared to vote for a social democrat, if a social democrat is unelectable, then Bernie Sanders, it would be impossible for him to be leading in every single metric. So now the mainstream media, they're going to have to, this is huge in more ways than one. It's hard to even put into words, because this has to completely change the discourse around the 2020 Democratic primary now, because the Joe Biden's more electable argument has just been exposed as just an establishment protection racket meant to prop up this unpopular, corrupt ass politician. So now that argument is just hot air and has been proven to be entirely fictitious, especially if Bernie Sanders gets a blowout here in New Hampshire. Now the media, they're going to have to change the narrative. They're going to have to come up with something different. Now they're going to have to go where they've been trying to avoid going with Bernie Sanders this entire time. And they're going to have to make the case that Bernie Sanders should not be the Democratic nominee, or might lose to Trump based off substance. And that is a place where no Bernie Sanders hater wants to go. They don't want to get into policy substance, because now they're going to have to just come out straight up and tell people, yeah. So they're going to have to just come out and just straight up gaslight people and tell them that, yeah, even though Medicare for All is overwhelmingly popular, and raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour is overwhelmingly popular, and ending the wars and actually doing something to address climate change, a multi-trillion-dollar Green New Deal, even though the American people seem to like that, Bernie Sanders still somehow is unelectable and he's going to lose to Donald Trump. That's literally the only argument that they have left. So Bernie Sanders is in tremendous position right now. And the only real question as to whether or not, the only real obstacle to Bernie Sanders winning the primary, it's none of his opponents, because Elizabeth Warren, her campaign is flaming out almost as bad as Joe Biden. And so those were his only two real competitors in this race. So now Bernie Sanders' main obstacle to the nomination, without a question, isn't any of his rivals. The only thing he has to worry about is how bad the Democratic Party is willing to cheat him to prevent him from getting the nomination. How much of what happened in Iowa are they willing to repeat in every single primary state to deny Bernie Sanders the nomination? How much chicanery and underhanded, unethical tricks are they going to pull to stop Bernie Sanders? That's really his only obstacle at this point. And yes, that's a real threat. But as a progressive, as a social democrat, as a leftist, this is quite literally the best position that we can be in this 2020 primary race. And it's looking like Bernie Sanders might clean house and run away with this thing by Super Tuesday, by March, which again goes to show how he's in such a great position, because there were so many choices. There were so many candidates in this race, a lot of them pretending to be like Bernie Sanders too. And the voters have shown that they aren't buying this shit. They want the real deal Holyfield, and that's Bernie Sanders. They want the OG. They want the tried and true candidate who's actually bringing about a political revolution to bust up the establishment and the corruption and bring social democratic reforms to the Democratic Party and to the country.